They thought $500 was enough to erase me from the picture. How tragically wrong they were. I didn't slam my fist on the table. I didn't scream or storm out. I simply sat down, opened my laptop, and pressed enter. That single keystroke vaporized $12 million from their coffers, and that was just the tip of the iceberg. My name is Clara Whitmore, and I'm going to tell you exactly how a $500,000 termination fee became the most expensive mistake in Orion Core Systems' corporate history. Let me paint you the picture first. At 35, I'd spent the better part of a decade as Orion's ghost in the machine, the systems engineer who kept the lights on while everyone else took credit for the pretty presentations. Portland Rain had been my soundtrack through countless late nights debugging critical infrastructure, writing code that would become the backbone of everything Orion claimed to be. I wasn't the type to wave my own flag, never have been. While my colleagues networked at happy hours and politicked their way up the corporate ladder, I stayed in the trenches, building the foundation that kept millions of dollars in transactions flowing smoothly every single day. The irony wasn't lost on me that the most invisible person in the company had created the most visible impact on the bottom line. Orion Core Systems wasn't exactly a household name, but in the B2B payment processing world, we were the silent backbone that kept small to medium enterprises running. Our platform handled everything from payroll processing to vendor payments, and the core library that made it all possible, that was mine. Every function, every optimization, every late-night fix that prevented system-wide crashes, my fingerprints were all over it. The architecture was elegant in its simplicity, which is probably why it worked so well. I'd designed it to be modular, scalable, and most importantly, maintainable. The codebase was clean, documented, and built to last. It had to be, because I was usually the only one who truly understood how all the pieces fit together. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Corporate restructuring has a way of making even the most essential people feel expendable. And Orion's board decided they needed fresh blood in the C-suite. Enter Daniel Mercer, our shiny new Chief Technology Officer. Armed with an MBA from a prestigious business school and absolutely zero understanding of what actually kept our systems running. Daniel was everything I wasn't: polished, political, and pathologically obsessed with cleaning up the books and optimizing operational efficiency. He spoke in buzzwords and saw everything through the lens of spreadsheets and quarterly reports. To him, I wasn't a critical systems architect, I was a line item that needed justification. The collision was inevitable, but I never expected it to happen over something so trivial. It started on a Tuesday morning in October. Our primary monitoring system had been throwing intermittent alerts for weeks. Nothing catastrophic, but the kind of early warning signs that seasoned engineers learn not to ignore. The existing monitoring license was about to expire, and we needed an emergency upgrade to a more robust solution to prevent what I could see was going to be a significant outage. The upgrade cost exactly $512. In a company that burned through millions annually, this was pocket change. But it was also an unbudgeted expense, and in Daniel's New World Order, every penny needed approval. I'd been trying to get authorization for 3 days, 3 days of emails, Slack messages, and brief hallway conversations where Daniel would nod thoughtfully and promise to circle back on the approval. Meanwhile, our system stability was degrading by the hour. Thursday afternoon, I made the call. With our largest client's monthly processing run scheduled for Friday morning, I couldn't wait any longer. I purchased the monitoring license with my personal credit card and immediately implemented the upgrade. The system stabilized instantly, and Friday's processing completed without a hitch. I submitted the expense report that same day, along with a detailed explanation of why the emergency purchase had been necessary. In any rational organization, this would have been a non-issue, a dedicated employee preventing a potential disaster by spending $500 of their own money. But rational wasn't Daniel's strong suit. The email arrived Monday morning at 9:47 a.m. Subject line: regarding unauthorized expenditure, immediate meeting required. I walked into Daniel's corner office to find him flanked by Patricia from HR and Marcus from legal. The setup was theatrical. 3 people in suits arranged around a conference table like a tribunal, with a single chair positioned across from them for the defendant. Clara, Daniel began, his voice carrying that particular brand of corporate authority that middle managers use when they want to sound important. We need to discuss your recent violation of company expense policies. I kept my expression neutral. The monitoring system upgrade, I documented the business justification in my expense report. Without it, we would have faced significant downtime during peak processing hours. That's not the point, Daniel replied, sliding a printed copy of the expense policy across the table. Company policy clearly states that any expenditure over $200 requires pre-approval from department management. You spent $512 without authorization. I tried to get authorization for 3 days. The system was failing, and I had to make a judgment call to prevent. You had to follow protocol. Patricia interrupted, her HR smile not reaching her eyes. We can't have employees making unilateral spending decisions, regardless of their intentions. I leaned back in my chair, studying their faces. This wasn't about $500. This was about Daniel establishing dominance, making an example out of the engineer who didn't bow and scrape for his approval. In his mind, I represented the old guard, the institutional knowledge that made his MBA feel inadequate. So, what exactly are you proposing? I asked. Daniel's smile was predatory. We're terminating your employment, effective immediately. Your violation of company policy, combined with what we've observed as a pattern of insubordination and failure to adapt to new management structure, makes this an easy decision. The words hung in the air like smoke. After nearly 8 years of keeping Orion's systems running, of solving problems that would have cost them millions in downtime, of writing the code that literally kept the company alive, they were firing me over $500. And my reimbursement for the monitoring license? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Given the circumstances of the unauthorized purchase, the company won't be processing that reimbursement. Marcus from legal chimed in. Consider it a lesson in following proper procedures. That's when something clicked into place. They weren't just firing me, they were stealing from me, taking my money and my job in one swift corporate power play. The injustice of it burned. But more than that, it crystallized something that had been building in the back of my mind for months. I nodded calmly, gathered my things, and walked out of that office with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. They thought they were erasing me from their equation. But what they'd actually done was remove the only person who truly understood the foundation their entire business was built on. Here's what Daniel Mercer didn't know. Couldn't know, because he'd never bothered to dig into the technical details of what made Orion actually work. The core processing library that handled all payment transactions wasn't company property. It was mine. I'd written it entirely on my own time, using my personal equipment before Orion even existed in its current form. When I joined the company as one of their first technical hires, I'd licensed my existing code to them under a verbal agreement that had never been properly documented. In those early startup days, everyone was more focused on getting the product to market than on the fine print of intellectual property agreements. For 8 years, Orion had been using my proprietary code as the foundation of their entire business model. Every transaction, every client, every dollar of revenue flowed through algorithms that I owned outright. They'd built their whole empire on rented ground, and they'd just evicted their landlord. That evening, I sat in my home office in Northeast Portland, listening to the October rain tap against the windows, and began making phone calls. The first was to Beatrice Lane, my former roommate from college who'd gone on to become one of the city's most respected intellectual property attorneys. Clara? Beatrice's voice was warm when she picked up. It's been too long. What's going on? I explained the situation methodically, the termination, the intellectual property issues, the years of unlicensed usage. Beatrice listened without interruption, and I could practically hear her legal mind processing the implications. Jesus, Clara, do you have documentation proving ownership of the code? Every line. Git commits dating back to 2015, development logs on my personal machines, email threads discussing the original licensing arrangements. I've got it all. And they've been using this code commercially for how long? 8 years, processing millions of transactions annually. There was a long pause. Clara, if what you're telling me is accurate, we're not talking about a wrongful termination case. We're talking about one of the largest copyright infringement cases I've ever seen. The damages could be substantial. We met the next morning at Beatrice's downtown office. She'd already begun preliminary research, and the numbers were staggering. Based on Orion's publicly available financial reports and the essential nature of my code to their operations, we were looking at potential damages in the multiple millions. The key, Beatrice explained as we reviewed the documentation, is establishing clear ownership and demonstrating willful infringement. The fact that they just terminated you after years of using your code actually strengthens our position. It shows they were aware of your contributions and chose to cut you out rather than properly compensate you. Over the next 2 weeks, while Orion celebrated their streamlined operations and Daniel congratulated himself on eliminating a problematic employee, Beatrice and I methodically built our case. We documented every instance of my code being used in production, tracked down email chains that proved Orion's leadership knew about the licensing issues, and calculated the commercial value of 8 years of unauthorized usage. The research revealed something beautiful. Orion was completely dependent on my code. Their entire payment processing engine, the thing that generated 100% of their revenue, couldn't function without the algorithms I'd written. They'd built additional features and interfaces on top of it, but the core functionality was mine. More importantly, my analysis of their recent system logs, which I could still access through monitoring backdoors I'd installed for legitimate debugging purposes, showed that Daniel's cost-cutting measures were already causing problems. The junior developers he'd tasked with cleaning up and optimizing the codebase were introducing bugs and performance issues because they didn't understand the underlying architecture. It was like watching someone try to renovate a house by removing what they thought were decorative beams, not realizing they were actually load-bearing supports. The damage wasn't immediately visible, but the foundation was starting to crack. By early November, Orion's payment processing was experiencing intermittent failures. Nothing catastrophic yet, but the kind of reliability issues that make enterprise clients nervous. I watched from the outside as their support tickets multiplied and their engineering team worked increasingly frantic hours trying to patch problems they didn't fully understand. Daniel, meanwhile, was spinning the narrative that these were simply growing pains as they modernized their infrastructure. He'd hired a consulting firm to audit and optimize the codebase, which was corporate speak for, "We have no idea what we're doing." The consulting firm's report, which I obtained through a former colleague who still worked at Orion, was a masterpiece of technical illiteracy. They'd recommended removing redundant error handling and unnecessary computational overhead, the exact safety mechanisms I'd built to prevent system-wide failures. It was like watching a slow-motion disaster unfold. Every optimization they implemented made the system more fragile. Every bit of dead code they removed was actually a critical failsafe. They were systematically dismantling 8 years of careful engineering, and they were proud of themselves for doing it. The first major outage hit on November 15th, right in the middle of the month-end processing cycle that dozens of Orion's clients depended on. Payment transactions started failing seemingly at random, with error messages that made no sense to the current development team. What should have been a routine maintenance window turned into a 14-hour crisis that affected nearly half of their client base. The financial impact was immediate. Orion's largest client, a regional restaurant chain that processed payroll through the platform, couldn't pay their employees on time. A manufacturing company missed critical vendor payments, triggering penalty fees. The cascade of failures reached exactly the scale I'd predicted it would without proper monitoring and error handling. Daniel's response was predictably tone-deaf. Rather than acknowledge the systemic issues, he blamed the incident on legacy code complexity and announced an accelerated timeline for the infrastructure overhaul. He was doubling down on the same strategy that had caused the problem in the first place. That's when Beatrice and I decided it was time to make our move. The cease and desist letter arrived at Orion's offices on November 22nd, the day before Thanksgiving. The timing wasn't accidental. We wanted to give them something to think about over the long weekend. The letter was a thing of beauty, written in the precise legal language that Beatrice wielded like a scalpel. It detailed my ownership of the core processing library, documented 8 years of commercial usage without proper licensing, and demanded immediate cessation of all infringing activities. But the real masterpiece was the damages calculation. Based on Orion's revenue and the essential nature of my code to their operations, we were seeking $2. $7 million in licensing fees for historical usage, plus additional penalties for willful infringement, plus legal costs. The total came to just over $12 million. The letter gave them 30 days to respond with either full payment or a negotiated licensing agreement. Failure to comply would result in an immediate federal lawsuit for copyright infringement. Daniel's response came within hours, not days. His email to Beatrice was a masterclass in corporate bluster and legal ignorance. This is nothing more than an opportunistic shakedown from a disgruntled former employee. Any code written by Ms. Whitmore during her employment at Orion Core Systems is work for hire and belongs to the company. We reject these frivolous claims entirely and will vigorously defend against any legal action. Beatrice forwarded me the email with a single comment. They just made this so much easier. The fundamental problem with Daniel's position was that it was factually wrong. The code hadn't been written during my employment. It predated my time at Orion by months. I had documentation proving that I'd developed the core algorithms as a freelance project, then licensed them to Orion when I joined the company. The fact that this licensing had never been properly formalized didn't make it work for hire. More damaging to their position was the paper trail of emails and internal documents that showed Orion's leadership had been aware of the intellectual property issues for years. I'd raised concerns about proper licensing agreements multiple times, only to be told that we'd handle the paperwork later when things were less hectic. Later never came, and now they were facing the consequences of their negligence. The lawsuit was filed in federal court on December 3rd. Within 24 hours, the story had been picked up by several technology industry publications. The narrative was irresistible. A systems engineer fired over $500 strikes back with a $12 million copyright infringement claim. The coverage was devastating for Orion. One article in TechCrunch included quotes from former employees confirming that my code was indeed the foundation of their entire platform. Another piece in Ars Technica featured an interview with a payments industry analyst who estimated that replacing my code would take years of development and tens of millions of dollars in engineering costs. But the real damage came from Orion's existing clients, who suddenly realized that the platform they'd been relying on might disappear overnight if I won the lawsuit. The uncertainty was poison to enterprise sales, and Orion's business development team watched helplessly as prospect after prospect chose competitors rather than risk getting caught up in a legal mess. Daniel tried to control the narrative with a series of increasingly desperate press releases. He claimed that Orion had multiple contingency plans and that the lawsuit would have no material impact on operations. But anyone who understood the technical realities knew these were empty words. You can't simply replace the core of a payment processing system without rebuilding everything from scratch. The discovery phase of the lawsuit was a prosecutor's dream. Beatrice's subpoenas turned up email threads where Orion executives explicitly discussed the need to resolve the Clara situation and acknowledged that they were technically licensing her code without formal agreements. Internal Slack messages showed developers complaining about not being able to understand or maintain the core processing functions. Most damaging of all was Daniel's own communication history, which revealed his true motivations for firing me. In one particularly incriminating email to the board, he'd written, "Whitmore represents the old technical culture that's holding us back from scale. Her departure will send a clear message about our new operational standards." By January, Orion's position had become untenable. The legal costs were mounting, their client base was eroding, and the technical problems in their system were getting worse as their developers continued trying to fix code they didn't understand. The second major outage occurred on January 15th, and this one was catastrophic. A seemingly minor update to the payment routing logic triggered a cascade failure that brought down the entire platform for 36 hours. Dozens of clients missed critical business payments, and several threatened lawsuits of their own. The technical post-mortem, which leaked to the press within days, was brutal. The root cause was traced directly to the removal of error-handling code that I'd written to prevent exactly this type of systemic failure. The junior developer who deleted it hadn't understood its purpose and had classified it as dead code during one of their optimization sprints. That's when the board finally intervened. Daniel was placed on administrative leave while they conducted an internal review. But everyone knew his days were numbered. The company that had fired me for spending $500 without approval had just lost millions in revenue because they'd ignored my technical expertise. The settlement negotiations began in February. Orion's new legal team, led by someone who actually understood intellectual property law, approached the discussions with a much more realistic perspective than Daniel had shown. Their opening offer was insulting: $2 million for a perpetual license with no admission of wrongdoing. Beatrice countered with our original demand: $12 million in damages, plus ongoing licensing fees, plus a public acknowledgement of my contributions to Orion's success. The negotiations stretched over 6 weeks, with each side presenting evidence and arguing over valuations. But the underlying reality was simple. Orion needed my code to survive, and I held all the cards. The breakthrough came when Orion's technical team finally admitted what I'd known all along. They couldn't replace my code without fundamentally rebuilding their entire platform. The cost and time required would effectively destroy the company's competitive position and probably trigger a complete loss of their client base. The final settlement was announced on March 20th. Orion agreed to pay $12.3 million in total, $8.5 million for historical licensing fees and damages, $2.1 million in legal costs, and $1.7 million for a 5-year licensing agreement that would give them time to develop replacement systems. But the money was only part of my victory. The settlement also required Orion to issue a public statement acknowledging that their core payment processing technology had been developed by me, and that my contributions had been essential to the company's technical success. It was a corporate mea culpa that would be preserved in press releases and SEC filings forever. Daniel Mercer officially resigned 2 days after the settlement was announced. His farewell email to the company was a study in deflection and face-saving. But everyone knew the real story. He'd turned a routine personnel decision into a $12 million disaster through pure arrogance and incompetence. The irony was perfect. The man who'd fired me for spending $500 without approval had cost his company 24,000 times that amount through his own unauthorized decision-making. With the settlement funds secured, I established Whitmore CodeWorks as an independent software licensing company. The business model was elegant. I would continue developing and maintaining the core processing library that Orion and other clients needed. But now, as a proper vendor with clear contracts and appropriate compensation, the demand was immediate and overwhelming. Orion's competitors had been watching the lawsuit carefully, and they recognized the strategic value of licensing proven, battle-tested code rather than developing their own solutions from scratch. Within 6 months, I had licensing agreements with 8 different companies in the payments industry. But more satisfying than the financial success was the cultural shift it represented. The story of my revenge had become legend in Portland's tech community, a cautionary tale about respecting the engineers who actually build the products that make companies successful. I started getting speaking invitations at technology conferences, not to talk about my code, but about the importance of intellectual property protection and fair compensation for technical contributions. The narrative had evolved beyond personal revenge into a broader conversation about how the industry treats its most valuable contributors. The physical transformation was equally dramatic. I moved from my cramped Northeast Portland apartment to a restored Craftsman house in the Hawthorne district, complete with a dedicated home office that looked out over the city skyline. The space was designed for focus and creativity, with multiple high-end monitors, ergonomic furniture, and the kind of premium development tools that I'd never been able to justify as an employee. My daily routine settled into a rhythm that would have been impossible in the corporate world. I worked when I was most productive, took breaks when I needed them, and spent my time solving interesting technical problems rather than navigating office politics. The stress-induced insomnia that had plagued me during my final months at Orion disappeared entirely. But the real satisfaction came from the quality of my work. Without the pressure of quarterly reviews and budget constraints, I could focus on writing code that was truly elegant and maintainable. The new version of the processing library that I developed for my licensing clients was faster, more secure, and more reliable than anything I'd been able to create under corporate constraints. By December, exactly 1 year after the lawsuit had been filed, Whitmore CodeWorks was generating more annual revenue than I'd ever earned as a salary employee. The licensing model scaled beautifully. Each new client increased my income without proportionally increasing my workload. The Orion settlement had given me something more valuable than money. It had given me control. Control over my time, my work, and my professional relationships. I no longer had to justify my decisions to managers who didn't understand the technical complexities involved. I could focus on creating value rather than managing up. The industry recognition followed naturally. When you're solving real problems for multiple companies and delivering measurable results, word spreads quickly in the tight-knit payments technology community. I started receiving acquisition offers from larger companies who wanted to bring my capabilities in-house, but I turned them all down. The whole point of the exercise had been to avoid exactly that kind of corporate structure. As winter settled over Portland again, I found myself reflecting on the chain of events that had led me to this point. Daniel Mercer's decision to fire me over $500 had seemed like a career-ending catastrophe at the time. In reality, it had been the catalyst that forced me to recognize my true value and fight for appropriate compensation. The lesson wasn't just about intellectual property law or corporate politics. It was about understanding your worth and being willing to defend it, even when the odds seem overwhelming. Too many talented engineers accept whatever treatment they receive because they assume they have no alternatives. My story proved that assumption wrong. There was a deeper satisfaction in knowing that my revenge had been achieved through competence rather than sabotage. I hadn't hacked into Orion's systems or stolen their data or done anything unethical. I'd simply enforced my legitimate legal rights and let their own technical incompetence do the rest. The final chapter of this story played out on a rainy Thursday evening in December, almost exactly 2 years after my termination. I was working late in my home office, debugging a complex integration issue for a new client, when I received an unexpected email. It was from Patricia, the HR manager who'd been present at my termination meeting. She was no longer with Orion, apparently. The company had gone through several rounds of layoffs following the settlement, and was reaching out to ask if I had any opportunities at Whitmore CodeWorks. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. The woman who'd smiled coldly while they fired me for spending my own money to keep their systems running was now asking me for a job. I stared at the email for a long time, considering how to respond. In the end, I replied with professional courtesy but no commitment. I thanked her for reaching out and explained that I wasn't currently hiring, but that I'd keep her resume on file for future opportunities. It was the kind of polite rejection that every job seeker recognizes, delivered with the same corporate politeness she'd once used against me. But that interaction crystallized something important about the nature of real success. The goal had never been to destroy Orion or ruin individual careers. It had been to establish proper recognition and compensation for value created. The fact that some people's careers had been damaged in the process was simply a consequence of their own poor decisions. As I finished that evening's work and prepared to shut down my computers, I allowed myself a moment of pure satisfaction. The rain was pattering against the windows of my home office, the same Portland soundtrack that had accompanied so many late nights of unappreciated labor at Orion. But now I was working for myself, building something that belonged to me, with clients who respected my expertise and paid appropriately for it. My phone buzzed with a text from Beatrice. Just closed another licensing deal for you. The contracts are getting easier now that everyone knows you're the real deal. Dinner this weekend to celebrate, I replied with a thumbs up and a restaurant suggestion. Then returned to my final task of the day, reviewing the profit and loss statement for Whitmore Codeworks. The numbers told a story of steady growth and sustainable success, built on a foundation of technical competence and fair compensation. The company that had fired me for $500 now paid me more than that amount every single day in licensing fees. The man who'd called me insubordinate had destroyed his own career through incompetence and arrogance. The corporate structure that had treated me as expendable had learned the hard way that some people are actually irreplaceable. But perhaps the most satisfying element of the entire saga was its elegance. There had been no dramatic confrontations, no hacking or sabotage, no unethical behavior of any kind. I'd simply insisted on being properly compensated for the value I created, and I'd been willing to enforce that insistence through legal channels when necessary. The final image of this story is me, sitting in my home office on that December evening, looking out at the Portland skyline through rain-streaked windows. One hand was typing code that would process millions of dollars in transactions for my clients. The other was raising a glass of wine in a private toast to the perfect symmetry of professional revenge. $500 had bought Daniel Mercer the right to fire me. But fixing that mistake? That ticket cost $12,300,000. And the next ticket, for anyone else who might be tempted to undervalue technical expertise? Well, I'm the one selling those tickets now. And the price has only gone up.